Так, привет. Я Никита, и я, в общем-то, по-русски говорю, но этот доклад будет по-английски, потому что это мне легче. Значит, hi, I'm Nikita, and I've been working on PHP core development for a couple of years, so since about PHP 5.5. And mostly I did this in my free time as a student. And recently a nice company called JetBrains, who also produced the PHP Storm IDE that probably a lot of you are using for PHP development. They have hired me to continue working on PHP and moving the language forward. So thank you, JetBrains. So this talk is going to be about PHP 7.4. And first of all, I just want to show the basic timeline where we are right now. So next month we have the first alpha release. Then about a month later the first beta release, and this one is important because that's where all the features are decided. So we still have about 2 months to get extra stuff in, but I think more or less PHP 7.4 will be as I will describe it today. And final release in November, and 1 year later will be PHP 8, or at least approximately 1 year later. We have already decided that we want to do a new major version, and Dmitry is going to talk about that one more. So in PHP 7.4 we have a lot of new features. I think this is the largest release we have since PHP 7.0, and I'll be talking about all of those. Apart from the first one, because so FFI, the foreign function interface, and preloading, those were both features that Dmitry implemented, and I think he will talk a lot more about them in his own talk. So, to start with, I think personally the most important feature in PHP 7.4 is going to be type properties. The idea is very simple. So we already have types for parameters, we have types for return types, so for return values. So it only makes sense that we also have types for properties. In this example, we have a user with an integer ID with a string name, and if you try to assign an array to the name, an array is not a string, so you get a type error. And there are a couple of things to mention about this feature. One in particular is how the initialization works. Because usually in PHP properties, if you don't give them a default value, they will be null by default. And this is not the case for type properties. So type properties always have to be explicitly initialized. If you don't initialize a type property and you try to access it, you get an exception. So even if you declare a nullable property, it's also not going to be null by default. You have to specify this explicitly if you do want to have it. And the background for this behavior is that we don't really want to add a null default value by default, because that essentially means that all the properties implicitly become nullable. And this is kind of famously what is called the $1 billion mistake in Java, so that everything is nullable there by default, and we want to avoid this particular problem in PHP. Then the second thing worth mentioning is that type properties have support for references, and this was actually the main challenge from the implementation side. So this is where 95% of the effort behind this feature went. And the basic problem is that you can create a reference to a type property. So here the variable ID is a reference to the property user ID. And then you can modify the property indirectly through that reference. And we still have to enforce the type. And we do this, so for each reference we track which type properties are part of it. And then you get this kind of nice error message that says, okay, you're trying to assign a string to a reference that is also held by a type property with an incompatible type. And this feature is quite complicated in the details. as maybe this example illustrates, so PHP doesn't have intersection types. You can't say that a value must be both traversable and countable, at least not in the type system. But what we do here is we have two properties. One is traversable, one is countable. And then we create a reference to both of these properties. And effectively, this means that the type we have to enforce here is that it has to be both traversable and countable. So this code works because array iterator is traversable and countable, but if you try something like sign and append iterator, it's only an iterator but not countable, this is going to throw an error. So references can contain multiple type properties, and we have to enforce all of those. And another just like fun thing you can do with it, but definitely shouldn't do, is like one of the next logical steps after type properties is to have also typed local variables. So here we declare that the variable I is an integer and should always stay an integer. And we can actually kind of emulate this now through the type properties and references. So we can create a function int, and what it does is create a dummy object with a type property and return a reference to that type property. And then that is going to be enforced. Unfortunately, or maybe even fortunately, this only works if the object stays alive. So if the object is destroyed, the type property is destroyed, and it's not going to be enforced anymore. So for this to work, we actually have to leak the object that is used to enforce this. And I say that this is maybe not a bad thing, because otherwise I suspect that people would actually try to use this in practice. Okay, to get back to more practical things, one of the main motivations for having this feature is to get rid of the getter and setter pattern. So in this code, the only real purpose the getter and the setter serve is to enforce the type. So we could, without loss of functionality, replace that private property and the getter setter with a single public type property. The only problem is, and what many people have reasonably told me, is that what if we actually have to enforce additional constraints somewhere down the line? Right now we don't really have a good way to do that, so the only way to keep the property and enforce an extra constraint is to use a magic setter method or something like that, and this is going to quickly get very ugly. So one feature I would like to have in the future, so again this is future scope, not in PHP 7.2, is to have first-class accessor support. So in this case we say that the property name has the normal getter semantics, but if you try to set it, we insert an extra check that the name must be non-empty. So I think this is one of the big missing pieces as far as property support in PHP is concerned. The other one is probably read-only properties. Okay. So that was one of the big features. I think the second one, or depending on who you ask, either this is a very important feature or a useless bit of syntax rigor. But yeah, here we have an example, just an array filter, and we are filtering out all the values that are part of some kind of allowed set of values. And in PHP 7.4 you can write this a bit more compactly with the arrow function notation that has the fn prefix and then the fat arrow syntax. And the idea behind the syntax is basically that it's compact enough that you can see at a glance what the operation that's being performed is. So you are not lost in the syntactic boilerplate of all the normal closure syntax and the use list and so on. And large part of why that is the case is that the allowed values variable in this case is going to be imported automatically, so you don't have to explicitly specify it. I should say one important thing about this is that the variables are all imported by value. So this kind of example doesn't work. If you modify a variable inside the arrow function, it's not going to affect the value outside the arrow function. And that's intentional, and this example illustrates kind of why we have this kind of behavior. And the root cause is really that PHP does not have lexical scoping. PHP only has a function scope. And this means that if you have this kind of example, the idea here is that that you have like 3 different closures, and the first one should return value 1, the second one value 2, and the third one value 3. And with by-value binding, that's what happens. But if we used by-reference binding, then actually all of these closures would reference the same variable. And after the loop, they would all return the same value, which is the last value that was assigned to this variable. And this kind of behavior is very, in my eyes at least, very unintuitive. And that's why we have the by-value binding where we don't have this kind of problem. I think this is like the most important question that we have discussed at very, very, very great length when we introduced the syntax is why do we have the fn prefix? And so many people would much prefer to have the syntax from JavaScript, which is basically exactly the same, just without this prefix. And there are 2 reasons why we have this. The first one is that PHP already uses the fat arrow syntax for array keys. So in this example, it's not directly obvious, is this an array of arrow functions, or is this just a normal key value map? So if we wanted to have the syntax, we would be forced to resolve this in favor of saying this is a normal map, and if you want to use arrow functions, you would have to place them in extra brackets or an extra parenthesis. The second and really the larger problem for us is simply a technical one. So if you look at these kind of maybe edge case examples, and just read them from left to right. The first one looks like just a normal assignment at the start. The second one looks like a constant fetch and a bitwise AND. And the third one looks like a ternary operator. So if you just try to process the syntax from left to right, we already need to introduce special handling for the arrow function when we see the opening parenthesis. But we actually only know it's an arrow function when we see the arrow. So what we need here is in the parser to have infinite look ahead in the code, while currently PHP is a language that only has to look 1 token ahead. And this is the kind of change we really did not want to introduce if there is some kind of alternative. And that's why we have the fn prefix. Finally, one thing the arrow functions currently don't support is block syntax. So arrow functions is just a single expression. We could extend it somehow like this, in which case the only difference between an arrow function in block form and a usual closure would be that we have the implicit variable capture instead of the explicit use list. So this is something we might do in the future, just so there is basically only one syntax you can always use instead of switching between 2 different ones, even though in this case the difference becomes kind of minor. Okay, so this is one more important feature, and I should say a disclaimer here. Everything else I'm talking about is already in PHP 7.4. It's already implemented, and it will definitely be part of the release. This feature is something that we're still fighting with. It has lots of technical issues, and that I hope we'll resolve, but so no promises. And what this is about, so covariant return types is a technical term for this kind of code pattern. You have a class B extends A, and then a method that returns A, and a child method that returns B. So the parent method returns something more general, and the child method returns something more specific. And this is perfectly sound, because even though the child method returns B is still an instance of A, so it still satisfies the contract of the parent method. And the only reason we didn't allow this is for technical reasons. And one particularly common case of this is nope, sorry, jump slides. Is the case of self-return types. So especially if you have fluent interfaces and you return this everywhere, you would like to use self as a return type. But this kind of code currently doesn't work, even though it looks like the return types are the same for both classes. In reality, the top one returns foo, the bottom one returns bar, and they differ, so right now you would get an error for this. And with covariant return types, this code would be allowed. And the technical issues I mentioned they all basically come down to this kind of problem. So right now, when PHP performs inheritance, all the needed classes are already known because the inheritance has a tree form. It doesn't contain cycles, or not even a tree. It's a directed acyclic graph. But with this covariant support, we actually can have cycles. For example, in this case, when we try to verify the class B and see the C return type, we have to load this class in order to find out if C is a subclass of B. But at this point, the class C is simply not defined, and we can't perform this check. So this code in this form definitely is not going to work in 7.4. But we hope to at least make this work in the case where the code goes through an autoloader, because this is how PHP is usually written nowadays. But this kind of cyclic dependency is what fundamentally the problem is here. Then next to covariant return types, we also have the reverse situation, which is contravariant parameter types. This is the same thing, just the other way around. So here the parent method accepts something specific and the child method accepts something more general, which is also fine because the child method still accepts the specific value, just also more in addition to that. But I should say that while this is like perfectly valid, I don't think I have ever seen a situation where this is actually really useful. So it's allowed, but maybe not super important. What is more common, I think, is that people attempt to use covariant parameter types. Classical example is something like this. So you have an event handler interface that handles generic events. And then you try to implement a specific event handler that can only handle a specific type of event. So this kind of pattern is pretty common, and it's from a type system perspective not sound, because the specific event handler violates the contract of the interface. Because the interface says I can handle all events, but this specific event handler can only handle a subset. And there is a correct way to express this. Unfortunately, this correct way requires generics. So what you would want to say is that the event handler is parameterized over an event type, and then the specific event handler implements the event handler interface for that specific event type. So this is, again, future scope. I would very much like to have generics in PHP, but unfortunately it's a tricky feature, both in terms of how exactly it should work in a dynamic language like PHP and just from the implementation side. So I think those were the three big language level features. There is two bits of small syntax sugar. One is the null coalesce equal operator, which works the same way as plus equal or minus equal. So just this kind of desugaring. And just like the normal null coalesce operator, the right-hand side is only evaluated if the left-hand side is actually null or completely unset. So it's okay to put some kind of expensive default value in there, like an object construction or something more expensive. The second bit of syntax sugar is the array spread operator. So we already have support since 5.6, I think, for array unpacking inside calls, which is shown at the top. And the same syntax now also works for array declarations. So here we have the elements 1, 2, and then we unpack an extra array for the remaining elements. And then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So, like basically, the functionality works the same as array merge. They are more or less equivalent in this case. One difference is that the array spread operator and array unpacking in general also supports iterators. One thing it doesn't support, on the other hand, is string keys. So this operator is intended only for real sequential arrays, not for maps. So this code is going to give an error. And one very related feature would be the same operation on the other side. So in array destructuring or in the list syntax. And this is again not part of PHP 7.4, but maybe something we could have in the future. And the reason why it's not in 7.4 is that the behavior is really unclear what exactly this should do. The fundamental problem is that in PHP PHP has a notion of array ordering and the array keys, and both of these don't have to match. So in this case, if you go by order, the array is 2, 1, 0, and if you go by the array keys, it is 0, 1, 2. And it's not really clear what exactly this syntax should result in the end. Okay, so that was the language level changes. There is also one small but fairly important addition in the standard library, and that's weak references. The idea behind the weak reference is that you can reference an object without keeping it alive. So the object can still be garbage collected. In this case, we do the unset call, and after the unset, the weak reference is going to return null. And one important application of this weak reference concept, I should say it's not a very good application, but one still something that people will likely try to do, is to have some kind of usually caching structure where you want to associate extra data with an object. And one way to do it would be this. So we index a map using the object ID. The problem is just that the object ID is not globally unique. So when the object is destroyed, the object ID gets reused. And then we could try to look up in this map some kind of new object with the same ID and get the incorrect data for it. In this case, the only purpose the weak reference actually serves is to check whether the original object has been destroyed or not. So we only use it for a null check. If we get back null, then we know that this data is from an old object and we should discard it. So what the weak reference in this case solves is that it doesn't keep the object alive. But what it doesn't solve is that it keeps the data alive. So even if the object has been destroyed, the data will not be automatically removed from this map or from this caching structure. And the real solution to this problem is a weak map, which does this properly, so it doesn't keep the object alive, and if the object is destroyed, it will immediately remove the data from the map. But right now the weak map is not in 7.4, but I am kind of thinking that maybe we should include this as well, because otherwise people will do some very suboptimal things with the weak references. Really, the weak map is the more usual feature, the more useful feature for most use cases. Okay, and that's it from additions, at least for the bigger additions. As usual, there are a couple of deprecations in each release, and I was a bit surprised when I was preparing for this talk that there are so few of them. So maybe this is something I have to still add a couple more things to this list. So one of the deprecations is related to the ternary operator, or the nesting of the ternary operator. If you have this kind of code, the way it is intended is a nested if-else. So if A is 1, we return 1. If A is 2, we return 2. Otherwise, we return something else. And this is also how most languages interpret a nested ternary statement, a ternary expression. However, in PHP it is handled in a different way, as shown at the bottom. And if you just look at this code and think about what this does, it doesn't really make any sense. And this is basically just a very, very old bug in the PHP parser that has survived to this day. And in PHP 7.4 we are going to throw a deprecation warning for the code above and require you to place explicit parentheses to show which meaning you intend. And in PHP 8 is going to be a hard error. Very similar change for concatenation. So in this example we have sum a plus b, and clearly it was intended that you first do the a plus b and then concatenate it to sum. What actually happens is that we first concatenate sum and a, so we get back a string, and then we add the second number to that string, which is again not what was intended. So here, deprecation warning in 7.4 and in PHP 8, this is actually going to change the behavior to the new interpretation. And one last thing. I hate talking about this one because there was a proposal accepted recently to deprecate the short tags, so the ones without the PHP inside them, in PHP 7.4 and to remove this feature in PHP 8. But after this proposal was accepted by like a very, very narrow margin in voting, there was a big outcry on the mailing list. People saying that, oh my god, this is going to break all our code, and this might actually leak code if you use short tags, and they just suddenly get disabled, and so on. So right now this proposal is kind of in limbo, and it's not clear what's going to happen. But I think I can safely say that if you are using short tags, still nowadays, now would be a good time to migrate, because it seems that they are on the way out, regardless of how exactly it will happen. Okay, and with that, I just want to say, if you want to do some quick testing of PHP 7.4 or even PHP 8, on the eval.org site there is an RFCs and upcoming releases tab where you can just check code snippets. If you have open source libraries, I think it's always really great to test pre-release versions of PHP, because it allows both you to catch backwards compatibility issues earlier, and us to get those bug reports and maybe be able to do something about them instead of getting them after the release, when we maybe no longer have an option to change things. And on Travis right now there is the 7.4 snapshot version, and the nightly version is PHP 8. And if you test PHP 8, you also have to specify the ignore platform requirements option for Composer, because PHP unit right now isn't officially compatible with PHP 8. It actually works, but it just doesn't specify that in Composer. And finally, there are a couple of ready-made Docker containers for PHP 7.4, for PHP 8, which you can use for some, larger scale testing without actually having to go through the trouble of compiling PHP yourself. And with that, this is all I wanted to say. So thanks. Okay, that was shorter than I expected. And feel free to also ask questions in Russian if you like.
Hi, thank you for the talking. And the question is, why PHP unit afraid to be compatible with PHP 8? Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't catch afraid.
Yeah, why PHP unit afraid to be compatible with PHP unit? What's happened?
I don't think it's afraid of anything in particular, and as far as I know, it doesn't have any actual backwards compatibility issues with PHP 8. It's just a question of policy. So PHP unit doesn't declare compatibility with new PHP versions this early, because it might happen that we are still going to do breaking changes, and by the time that PHP 8 is going to be released, it's no longer going to be compatible, so they don't want to commit to it right now, which is, I think, smart.
So they are waiting for your release.
Yeah, or at least to be closer to the release.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the lecture. You can't see me because I'm here.
Yeah.
Thank you once again. Two short questions. First, as far as I understood, you told there will be no more implicit initialization for the fields, for the class fields. Does that mean that there will be change in the crazy isSet behavior, which doesn't really check if a field is set, but also checks if it is null, is equal to null?
Okay.
And second, when you were talking about future field accessors, you told there is proposed short syntax for getters and setters. Is it are there plans to provide different access levels for getters and setters? And will there be a way to make read-only or write-only fields that way? Thank you.
Okay. So the first question, I should first say that the initialization behavior is only for type properties. So normal properties continue to work as usual because of backwards compatibility. And the isSet behavior is not going to change. So isSet is always set and not null. And I don't think we will ever change that again because of backwards compatibility reasons. If anything, we could introduce a new language construct, something like exists, that only checks for existence but not for null. But I'm not sure if it's actually worthwhile to introduce this kind of additional distinction. And the second question, what was the second question? Protected private. Yeah, okay. So the property accessor stuff I mentioned, there actually was a proposal a couple of years ago already for the syntax. It was declined. I think in part for mainly technical reasons, because the implementation was a bit not great and overly complicated. But this proposal did include asymmetric visibility, so you were able to say something like public get and private set, which is one of the typical use cases. And read-only properties, depending on how you interpret it, can be either realized through this feature, or as a separate one if you actually mean properties that can only be, for example, that can only be written once. So like final in Java, for example, that would be a separate feature, but one that would of course be nice to have.
Никита, я здесь. Никита, я справа от тебя.
Справа?
Да. Я спрошу тебя по-русски, прости. FN теперь ключевое слово? Или как оно... Есть ли там примеры кода, которые внезапно могут поменять свое поведение, которые FN в себя включают? Не знаю, функция, которая FN называется, например.
Ну да, FN это будет настоящее ключевое слово, в смысле больше нельзя использовать как, например, имя функции или имя namespace. Можно еще использовать как имя метода или константы в классе, потому что там мы разрешаем это. Ну да, в общем-то мы там немножко анализировали код на Packages, популярные пакеты, и вроде бы результат, что fn используется только в тестах и в одной библиотеке, которой я сам написал. Ну и я там уже переименовал этот fn на func. Ну да.
May I ask?
Yeah.
Okay. I have a question about maybe a feature that maybe will be implemented or not. It is interesting for me if PHP is going to implement feature of multiple return values. Can you say about plans?
So I don't think. I mean, you already can kind of do multiple return values by returning an array, and then on the call side use array destructuring. So this is, I think, nearly as good as multiple return values, just extra brackets. I think maybe what you have in mind is also the ability to specify types for the multiple return values. So that would be again a nice feature to have. So right now the only thing we have is an array type hint, but you can't specify what is inside the array, and it would be nice to specify, okay, especially for the multiple return type case, that the first element is an integer, the second element is a string or something like that. Yeah, maybe, but no specific plans right now.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the talk and all the great work you are doing, especially in improving the type system. I want to ask you, how do you think could PHP one day become a fully type-safe, strongly typed language?
So I think many people would really disagree with going into that direction. And I mean, one question is, if you really want to have a fully type-safe, strongly typed language, then why use PHP and not something like Java? But I think, I mean, clearly our direction is going into to add more typing. Especially if we add generics, we are already kind of halfway there. But I think one main difference is still that we are only enforcing types at function boundaries or now at properties, but we don't have typing features for local variables. And I feel like this is probably something that is going to stay, so not something we want to introduce. So I think we will never be like fully type-safe language.
Thank you.
Hi, here I am.
Yeah.
So thank you for your speech and for everything you're doing for the PHP in common. I was very glad to see the generics as a possible feature in the future versions. So my question is, I asked the previous speaker, are there any plans on implementing the async features in PHP?
Oh, okay, that's a good question. So there is a proposal to introduce fibers, which is, well, one problem that maybe wasn't shown in the previous talk is that if you want to use async PHP, you have to basically pull this yield and yield from through your whole code base. So you have to switch everything from like normal calls to these kind of calls with a yield prefix. And one thing that fibers will allow you to do is to just do the function calls normally and allow you to use yield somewhere further down the call stack. So you don't have to use yield from for each call, but you can just use yield at the points where you actually need it. That's one of the improvements that may be coming. So that proposal has stalled a bit because people are like working out how exactly they want to implement it, but I think this is something that's coming.
Sounds great, thank you.
But actual async syntax, I haven't seen any talk about that. I mean, it would be great, but I don't think anyone is actively working on that right now.
Thank you.
Спасибо за доклад. По-русски вот вопрос, прошу прощения. По поводу развития системы типов хотелось бы спросить, есть ли вообще какие-нибудь планы по типизированным коллекциям в самом ядре?
Ну да, в общем-то там тоже был RFC для typed arrays, который мы решили не имплементировать, потому что это довольно, опять проблемы с перформансом там были. Я думаю, что type collections у нас будут в форме generics'ов. В смысле, если generics есть, можно сделать generic arrays. И ну, с этим сами array будут, конечно, типизированные, и можно и собственные генерические структуры тоже типизированные новые делать. Ну да, это опять сначала надо generics имплементировать.
Спасибо.
Hi, thank you for your speech. Very interesting. My question: what's about optimization? Will PHP 7.4 faster?
I think for optimization you should listen to the next talk by Dmitry. So PHP 7.4 is going to have the preloading feature in opcache that will remove some of the cost of loading classes at runtime. I think that's the main performance improvement in PHP 7.4. We don't have any large other changes apart from that. And in PHP 8 we will have the just-in-time compiler that Dmitry will also introduce. And that, depending on how it goes, could also give more performance improvements.
Thanks.
Hello, I'm here. You say, if I understood you correctly, that typed properties will be not null by default. It will be empty string or something like that. Yes. My question is, what about object type properties? Will they still will be null, or they will be object instance on initialization?
No, so all the properties don't have a default value by default. You can add the null default for objects, but that's the only one you can add. So maybe if I got the question right, is if we are going to support doing something like writing new std class inside the property initializer. Is that right?
As I understand, typed object type properties will not be null by default.
Yeah.
It will be like empty string. Is it not null, but object?
Okay. No, it will not be an empty string or similar. It will simply be uninitialized. So it's the same as unsetting the property right now. It doesn't have any value, and if you try to access it, you get an exception.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Nikita, for the great talk. I want to ask about one of the coolest feature called classes for scalars value, like integers, like strings. Should we expect this cool feature in nearest future? And is it possible to force it for the next major version of PHP, like PHP 8 maybe? So what's your opinion about typed scalars?
So yeah, I mean, I have an extension that implements that, so that you can take a string and call a method directly on the string. I think apart from like being more modern syntax-wise, this would be a great opportunity to clean up the standard library. So we have, I think, the most famous problem in PHP is the inconsistent naming and the inconsistent parameter order, and we could kind of fix a large part of that by switching to this scalar object approach. But I think there are also lots of people who are against it, because in PHP, strings, integers, and so on, they are not objects, and making them look like objects comes with certain problems, because like you will be able to call methods on them, but in all other ways they will not behave like objects. So I really like this approach, but I'm not going to promise that it's going to happen.
Thank you. Thank you, Nikita. Okay. Thank you for questions. Now you have to choose the best one. Which one did you like more?
I already forgot what all the questions were. I think you should judge that, what the best question was.
Me?
Yes.
I like all of them. So maybe
then pick randomly.
I like async stuff, so I like the question about async, and you said this is a good question, so maybe about the async one was okay. You should come here.
So I feel like my answer to all the questions was basically, yes, maybe we are going to do that, but no guarantees. But that's the truth.
And this is a small gift for you.
Thanks.